Welcome to the May Livermore Indivisible General Meeting. Thank you for spending time with us today on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. We know that you have other things to do, so we feel honored that you are spending time with us. This is the first time I am both the Zoom host and the Zoom moderator, so if something doesn't go perfectly correct, please understand. Our meeting today will feature Professor Stephen Vogel, followed by a short recap of our May 3rd rally and some follow-on activities. And we do have many upcoming events, so stay tuned, please. Before we get started with Professor Vogel's talk, I'd like to ask that you stay muted during this talk. When you entered the Zoom meeting, you were muted, so please stay muted during his talk. If you have any questions for Professor Vogel, please put them in the chat. We've gotten many excellent questions already and have shared them with the professor. If we don't have time to ask your particular question, Professor Vogel has offered to answer any additional questions that we don't have time for offline, and we'll include any of those responses in our next newsletter. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sherry Spain, who will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. It is my honor to introduce our speaker this month, Professor Stephen Vogel. Professor Stephen Vogel is the director of the Political Economy Program, the Hahn New Professor of Asian Studies, and a professor of Political Science and Political Economy at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Vogel specializes in the political economy of the advanced industrialized nations, especially Japan. His book, Marketcraft, How Governments Make Markets Work, argues that markets do not arise spontaneously, but rather are crafted by individuals, firms, and most of all by governments. Marketcraft is a core function comparable to statescraft. Thank you for joining us this Sunday afternoon, Professor. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you for that very gracious introduction. I'm delighted that you all have joined me this afternoon. Sorry I couldn't be out there in person, but I'm sure we'll have a good conversation. I'm going to try to share my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, can you see that? Yes?
Yes.
Yes,
Fantastic.
sir.
Okay, sorry about the delay. Just working out the technology here. Okay, so I wanted to talk about inequality, and I will promise to connect this to our current situation in the United States. But I'm kind of beginning with the question, if you wanted to address inequality, what would you do about it? And I'm kind of juxtaposing two possible solutions. So we can think about this in terms of a question. Should the government compensate people for the inequalities that result from markets? If you say yes, then you're advocating redistribution. Or should it reform society and markets to generate less inequality in the first place? That's what I mean by predistribution. So predistribution policies are those policies that not only try to compensate people after the fact, but that actually try to structure society so that it is more fair in the first place. And what I'm suggesting is that we should prioritize predistribution. I am not arguing, just to be clear, I'm not arguing against redistribution. I'm just saying that predistribution should be our top priority. And I'll make that argument based both on economic or justice reasons, but also political viability. So another way to think about this is that redistribution aims more at equality of outcomes, whereas predistribution aims more at equality of opportunity. Now, I realize that all sounds very abstract so far, so I'm going to try to be very concrete and give you specific examples of what I'm talking about. We can think of 4 buckets of policies: public investment, market governance, taxation, and spending. And what I'm suggesting is that the latter 2, tax and spending, are more on the redistribution side, and public investment and market governance are more on the predistribution side. So starting with the taxing and spending, this part is probably more familiar. If you have an unequal society, one of the things you could do about that is to have progressive taxation. In other words, tax the rich more and the poor less. Or you could have welfare services. And again, you could allocate those disproportionately to those who need them the more. So more spending on services for the poor, less spending on services for the rich. Either of those would be redistributive. And I should mention, kind of connecting all of this to our current moment, that there's another possibility. There's another possibility, which is upward redistribution. In other words, redistribution we think of as going from rich to poor, but it's at least hypothetically possible to redistribute from poor to rich. And there's some signs that that's what we're doing right now. For example, with taxation, the US generally, the more you earn, the more you pay in taxes. But in the current United States, that's actually not true for the very richest. They actually pay less in tax on average in terms of share of income than middle income taxpayers. Okay, so then let's talk about predistribution, which is more what I wanted to focus on today, because I think it's often less thought of as a solution to inequality, but I'm going to argue it's actually much more foundational, right? So the 2 buckets I have there are public investment and market governance. By public investment, we just might mean like public education, or health insurance, or communications or transport infrastructure. In a way, these are things that would contribute to a more substantive equality of opportunity. In other words, kind of trying to get people closer to a common starting line in life. So that's one big bucket of predistribution policies. And the other is market governance or market regulation. This is what I work on. And so I could talk about this all day, but I won't, promise. But the point I'm trying to make with respect to market regulation is that it's not just a matter of regulating markets to save us from the worst aspects of capitalism. You actually need regulation to make markets work in the first place. That's the idea of Marketcraft. But for today, what I really want to emphasize is that any market regulation is not neutral. What I mean by that is that market regulation sets the balance of power in the economy. And obviously, the balance of power in the economy affects the balance of power in politics. So again, I realize I'm being a little bit abstract, so I'm going to try to be concrete. This is a way I kind of think about this, is that you have different sets of policies that have effects on the balance of power between different actors within the economy. So again, to just make this concrete, let's start at the bottom. We've got employers and workers, and all the kind of arcane rules that you might apply to labor market actually affect that balance of power, right? And that's not abstract. That affects how much people take home, right? It affects wages. So I'll give you just one example of a nice arcane rule that has that effect, is that under the Biden administration, the government sought to ban non-compete clauses. So non-compete clauses are clauses in labor contracts whereby the employer could say, you can't go work for anybody of my competitors. Now, if you think about that, that violates the whole idea of a labor market, because you're saying to your workers, you can't work, you can't sell your skills to anyone else. My point is that that affects the balance of power between the employee and the employer. It shifts it toward the employer. Right? If you ban the non-competes, that shifts that balance of power towards the worker. So what I'm saying is that there's no natural spot on these like arrow lines I've got about where would be like the natural balance of power between these different actors. They're set by all of these detailed rules. And that same is true. I'm not going to go through all these examples, but for financial regulation or for antitrust policy. And so my point is that market governance is important. I'm going to try to go backwards here. Yeah. For setting the balance of power in our society. And because it's been moving over the past few decades toward those with more wealth and power, it wouldn't be crazy to try and move it in the other direction. And that would have major implications for economic inequality. Okay, so what's my point today? I'm arguing that the US should give higher priority to pre-distribution. My next point is where I'm going to connect this to where we are right now, May 2025 in the United States, right? Is that the US failure to pre-distribute has contributed to the loss of faith in government and the Democratic Party's loss of support from the working class. I'm going to mention some research that supports this idea in a minute. But the idea is that if you go back to the New Deal in the 1930s, it was interestingly a program that was had both the pre-distribution I was talking about. So you had labor legislation, financial legislation, public works, and also redistribution. You had, Social Security. In the post-war period, the Democratic Party focused more on redistribution and less on pre-distribution. And then since the 1980s, the government has further eroded pre-distribution to the point where the regulations have been shifting power away from consumers and workers and more towards corporations and the wealthy. You could argue that this is one of the reasons why the Democratic Party has lost support from lower and middle class Americans. So like I said, I'll talk about some research on that in a second. But if this is true, then going forward, we would need a kind of a three-stage strategy. First, to critique our current administration, which can be characterized by plutocratic populism, which I will define in a moment. Second, to create an alternative policy agenda for a future administration. And third, in the longer term, to rebalance power in our economy and our society so that we have a more fair and equitable system. So I mentioned plutocratic populism. This is a word used by my colleague Paul Pearson and others to describe policy programs or political programs, I guess I should say, that are designed to mobilize the masses, deploying the rhetoric of anti-elitism, like let's get those elites. And yet the goal is to redistribute resources to the wealthy and powerful. So if you just look at that definition, I think you can think very readily like that it's just riddled with contradictions because it's saying we're for the people, but you're actually, and you might say, well, that's crazy. Nobody would ever fall for that trick. And yet that's exactly what we're experiencing right now in the United States. Okay, so this is the research I alluded to a moment ago. And what these scholars did was they looked at the Democratic Party's pre-distribution policies. So that includes public investment, labor regulation, financial regulation, et cetera. And they concluded that there's been a decline in emphasis on those pre-distribution policies since the 1970s. And they argue that that helps to explain why the Democratic Party lost support from less educated Americans. Again, that may sound a little bit abstract, but let me try to make it very concrete. What they're saying is that American voters don't just want handouts, they want jobs. They want social standing and status. They want employment quality. They want job autonomy, flexible hours. In other words, they want to be able to make a decent living for if they work hard. And many Americans don't feel that way. And they don't just blame the Republican Party, they also blame the Democratic Party. So that's what these authors are saying. And so that's kind of the politics of predistribution. On the economics of predistribution, this is another set of economists. And what they have found is that if you want to understand why US inequality is so much more severe than that in Europe, you actually have to look at predistribution, not redistribution. Now, that's the opposite of what most of us think, right? Most of us think, well, Europe's more equal because in Sweden, they, tax at 80%, and they have, so you have huge taxes and huge welfare services. That's why they're more equal. And what these authors are saying is, no, actually, that's not why. That if you look at how much the economies redistribute, it's about the same, US and Europe. The difference is on the predistribution side. Right. So in terms of, the equity of the education system, the fairness of labor regulation, the design of corporate governance, those are the things that actually drive the inequality. And again, I say that's not intuitive because we think of Sweden as being super tax, super spending. But one reason that I think that these authors are right is that actually the US tax system is relatively progressive compared to Europe, unlike what we think. And that's for a fairly straightforward reason, that a lot of European taxation comes through the value-added tax, in other words, consumption tax. Consumption tax is regressive, right? Because the poor pay just about as much as the rich. So actually our tax system is more progressive than the European tax system. So if we're asking why inequality is more severe in the United States, it's not because of the tax system, it's because of those predistribution policies I was talking about a moment ago. Now, I haven't shown you data, but I will now. This is inequality in Europe versus the United States over the entire 20th century. And what you see is that inequality in both Europe and the US was high at the beginning of the 20th century. It's high again now. And in between, it was low. And that was for a couple of reasons. The big dip happened, you can see, with World War I and World War II, which wiped out a lot of wealth. And so when you wipe out wealth, you also wipe out inequality because you make everybody poor. I'm not recommending war as the solution to inequality, but that's what happens. And the other reason is in order to finance those wars, they raised taxes, including taxes on the wealthy. So as a result of war and tax, the US and Europe both became more equal toward the middle of the century, and the inequality started creeping up again after about 1970, but much more dramatically in the US, that's the top line, than in Europe, that's the bottom line. This is another way to look at that, except that this graph just starts in 1980, so it shows you what's been happening for the last 40 years in a slightly different way. And what it says is that the share of total income by the top 1% of Americans has dramatically increased, while the share of the bottom 50% has dramatically decreased. So the top 1% has gone from having 10% of US national income to having about 20%. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% has dropped from about 20% to about 14%. So that's inequality in America for you. This graph, more than anything, I think, sheds insight onto where we are as a country today. What it shows is the dark blue line is increases in labor productivity. So what that's telling you is that American workers have steadily become more productive over the entire post-war period at a fairly steady rate. And the light blue line is a typical average worker's wages. And so what this graph is telling you is that wages and productivity increased almost exactly in tandem from World War II through 1980. And then those lines have separated since 1980. And productivity has gone on and continued to increase while median wages have flattened. So more than anything, you say, like, why are Americans angry? This is one reason why they're angry, right? Because their standard of living of the average or lower or middle income American has not appreciated much. And if you think about it, this is a pretty powerful idea, because what it suggests a couple of things. First, it suggests that they aren't getting the benefit of their own productivity, right? As their own working productivity goes up until 1980, they were getting a return off of that increase. And that stopped happening in 1980. And the other thing that it means is that the growth of the economy did not help the median worker. So we talk about the US being a high growth country, and we do. We're outgrowing many of the other countries in Europe or Japan. But the median American is not feeling it. The benefits are all going to the top. This next graph is just a slightly different way of looking at that same idea. The bottom line is pretty much the same. It's saying, like, what are the wages of the bottom 50%? And it's saying they're basically flat through this entire period. But this top line is different from the last graph I showed you. This one is what's the income of the top 1%. So again, it's another way of showing you that all of the gains from growth have gone to the top, whereas the standard of living of the median American is flat. So I make a general kind of theoretical argument about why I think we should emphasize predistribution more. I'm not going to go into it in great detail because I'm eager to hear your questions and comments. But this is my summary slide of that argument, which is basically saying that predistribution is more fundamental. It's like redistribution addresses the symptoms. It gives people money who don't have it, right? But predistribution gets at the heart of what's driving inequality by giving people greater capacity and by balancing power within our economy. It's more just because it's saying, let's give American workers fair wages and let's give consumers fair value, right? So if you take the wages example, if we say that a company is overpaying its CEOs and underpaying its line workers, we could just let that happen and use the tax system to kind of compensate for that injustice, or we could try to address the injustice itself. So that's what I'm saying. This is much more of a fundamental solution. You could also say it's more just because it doesn't involve taking away from others. Now, you might say if somebody's making too much money, then you shouldn't feel too bad about taking their money and giving it to somebody else. But it's still, I think it's seen as less legitimate than it would be to try to make the system fairer in the first place. Redistribution is also more respectful of human dignity, because what redistribution does is it kind of gives an unjustified valence of legitimacy to those who make more, let's say, and it kind of and a shame or humiliation to those who need this help, right? So again, if you could sort that out on the front end, it would be much less degrading and disrespectful to those who rely on government, what we call handouts. I've already made the point about balancing power, so I won't stress that too much, except to say that balancing power in the economy balances power in the polity. And again, we're seeing the extreme opposite of that today, where the richest man in the world has outsized power. and also certain very powerful corporations have outsized power, and they're translating their economic power into political power. It's more market conforming because it tries to make markets work right rather than stopping them. And arguably, it's more feasible politically because there's a lot, and I don't want to overstate this case, but Americans do resist the idea of handouts, of transfers, but arguably it could be much easier to make the case that we should have a fair economy. On this point, I guess I would say the devil's in the details. Certain measures are going to be more popular than others. The Biden administration, to its credit, was trying to push the more politically popular buttons. They tried to ban the non-competes, but maybe more to the point, like they were trying to crack down on junk fees. Well, everybody in America hates junk fees, so that's something that has some political resonance. But that's also an example of a pre-distribution policy. So what would the policy recommendation be? I won't go into the arcane details, but I would say, first of all, one thing all Americans should be able to agree on, I'm not saying that they would, but they should, is that we should eliminate policies of upward redistribution. In other words, if our tax system or our education system is disproportionately benefiting those who already have more wealth and power, then we should stop doing that. Then I argue we should prioritize public investments, so this would include education, also infrastructure investment, to achieve substantive equality of opportunity. I use that word substantive in contrast to formal. So it's not just saying that people should be equal before the law, which of course they should, but we're saying like people should actually have a fair chance in life, right? And if that means that we have to have some extra public investment to make our worst schools better, or to make our worst neighborhoods more livable, then we should do that. Reform market governance to balance market and political power. I think I've covered that point. And the final 2 points are just saying that, and I didn't say this at the outset, but I had that table where I said all these different policies. What I didn't confess, which I will confess now, is that the lines blur in practice. So there's policies like childcare subsidies, which you could think of as both pre-distribution and redistribution. So in practice, that line it can get a little bit blurry or muddy, but I would argue doesn't matter because the conceptual distinction is useful. And more importantly, if a given policy has both pre-distributive and redistributive effects, then that's a reason why that's a good policy. I mentioned the example of childcare subsidies as being both. It's both in the following sense. By giving that subsidy, you're taking assets and you're moving them to people who need them, right? So that's redistribution. But you're also enabling that parent to go to school or to get a job, and that's pre-distributive. So that $1 is kind of having a double effect. And so my point is, okay, that means that my distinction is not perfect. I'm fine with that. But if a given policy can have both effects, then all the more reason to support it. So in the interest of time, I'm going to call it right there, and I really welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you, Professor. Much appreciate that. So we'll open up the chat for some questions, and then we do have a few earlier questions that we had wanted to address with yourself. The Senate has been considering the guiding and establishing national innovation for the U.S. stablecoins. It's called the Genius Act, that would establish a regulatory framework for stablecoins in the United States. What is your impression of the bill, and what did it get right, and what could it improve on?
I think I'm going to take a pass on that one. I'm happy to address it after the fact, but I'm not confident that I have evaluated that bill well enough to give you a good answer.
Gotcha. Okay, well, let's go to one of the other questions that was addressed in the chat. So, what happened in the 1980s that started this divergence shown in your graphs?
So the 1980s was the Reagan Revolution. Some people call it neoliberalism. And it was a response to the 1970s, the perceived failures of the 1970s in the US, particularly the Carter administration. And the idea was that the government had tried to do too much. I guess backing up one step, that golden era that I was talking about from 1945 to about 1970 was one where we had relatively high growth and relatively equitable distribution of income in the United States. And it seemed like we had fixed things like Keynesian economics. We had a mixed economy, a market economy, but the government would intervene in order to stabilize markets, and everything was going great. Then in the 1970s, we had two oil shocks. We had stagflation. As I said, we had the perception that the Democratic Party, and particularly the Jimmy Carter administration, had botched the economy. We had massive deficits. We had inflation. We had low growth. We needed to do something very different. So Reagan comes in and he says, the problem is the government is not the solution. Government is the problem. That may sound familiar. And the idea was to get the government out of the market. And so the policies included tax cuts, deregulation, and welfare cuts, spending cuts. It was pretty mild in comparison to what's happening right now in a lot of ways. But it did set a long-term trajectory. Because if you think back to that, the graph with the inequality I showed, the taxes on the rich went up during the period of World War I and World War II, and they came down in the 1980s. So I guess to recap, you had a reduction, you had tax cuts, particularly tax cuts for the rich. You had restraint on welfare spending. So two of the pieces of redistribution shifted away from redistribution. And then if we go to the pre-distribution side, you had a reduction in public investment, and you had regulatory change. Again, if you go to my arrows, that shifted in the direction that was more favorable to employers rather than workers, to financial companies rather than savers, and to shareholders rather than workers and communities and the corporate community. I studied deregulation. That's what I did my dissertation on. So and I won't go through that in great detail, but I'll just tell you that deregulation in the literal sense of less regulation never happened. That what Reagan did was not a deregulation, but a re-regulation, but it was a changing of regulations that favored corporations, it favored the wealthy, it favored the powerful. And so that now we can look and with 40 plus years of hindsight, and we can say that's what drove this change in the nature of the American economy. And like I said, it's not surprising that people are angry and frustrated about that. The puzzle is not that they're angry or frustrated. The puzzle is why that turns into votes for somebody who's not going to help them.
On that note, that fits perfectly with the next question because it seems like the same thing is happening again. The Trump administration has been impacting markets through deregulation, tariffs, eliminating regulatory agencies and reducing taxes on the corporations? What is the most dangerous and destructive idea or action of the Trump administration in your point of view? And what has it done, if anything, correctly?
That's a tough question for me because there's a lot to not like. But I think that the greatest threat, of course, is to our political institutions. I mean, I think economically, it's a disastrous set of policies. And I'm happy to go into that. But since you asked what's the greatest threat, the gravest threat is to our institutions. So that means our courts, right? So actions that violate our Constitution, not complying with court mandates to change behavior. That is a pretty frontal attack on the judiciary. The attack on state capacity, in other words, the mass firings of public servants, that has long-term impact in terms of our ability to govern. And even this administration, ultimately is going to have to govern. So I think, and they'll figure that out sooner or later, that it's not a great idea to attack your own best staff. Then there's the mode of governance. I don't quite know what the best word to describe it is, but it's some people say it's like we're going back several hundred years in terms of a government that is reigning, or a president who is reigning by wielding personal power in a very personalistic way. Right? What I mean by that is, rewarding and punishing specific companies and specific universities, not on the basis of a uniform policy, but in terms of just personal retribution or just a power grab to force institutions to his will. Again, for a few weeks, maybe that wouldn't be too damaging, but all of these things, to the extent that they continue, will have grave implications. Attacks on universities, law firms. In terms of the tariffs, I think that's an unwise policy economically. I think it will obviously raise prices. We haven't even talked about, undermining our international system, alliances and international institutions. So yes, if you add me to order, I would say threat to American democracy, number one, threat to international the international order, number two, destruction of state capacity, number three, unwise economic policies, number four. I'm sure there's lots of others, but that's my ranking for the moment. In terms of what the Trump administration, just like it's hard to say what's gone wrong because there's so much, it's hard to find what's positive because there's so little. But I'll give you one. On antitrust policy, the Trump administration has not completely reversed the policies of the Biden administration. The Biden administration was getting much more vigorous in its enforcement of antitrust, particularly taking on the outsized power of the big tech firms. In my view, that was a good thing. It's consistent with the pre-distribution argument I've been making today. The Trump administration is not throwing all of that out. So this is one area where there's some continuity. The cases against Google and Meta are proceeding. So that's one area where I would give them some credit. And then on foreign policy, I think it's too soon to tell. But even though most everything we do know is negative, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the Trump administration might do something good. If they can find a way to foster a more peaceful Middle East, I'm not saying they can, but if they do, great. Hats off to them. I think the chances are not great, but I wouldn't rule it out. Whereas in some of these areas, I think the direction is going to be negative, and it's just about a question of how bad it's going to be.
Excellent. Thank you for going into that detail, sir. There's a couple of questions on the board, and I'm going to kind of mesh them into together with some that I had previously. What does the predistribution actually look like? And is there a governance right now that practices that successfully?
Like another country?
Yes.
So predistribution, I think the easiest way to say what it means would be to, at least if you in your imaginations can go back to that table. I won't run back to it, but and think about the two buckets: public investment and market governance. So if we talk public investment, here's an easy way to think about it. If we look at the education system, the United States education spending is regressive. What I mean by that is that we spend more on those districts that are wealthier and less on those districts that are poor, on average. Right? So that means that our education spending is regressive. That's actually kind of unusual in a comparative sense. Japan, which I study, for example, is pretty flat, so about even across districts. In fact, that's a national goal. And in many European countries, it's progressive, meaning that they spend more on the poorer districts and less on the richer districts. There's obvious reasons for that, one of which is just that our education system is decentralized. So it's hard for us to achieve equity. But if you wanted to get rid of equity, then probably closing the Department of Education would be a great idea. In any case, so that's just an illustration of how public investment could either make the world fairer or make it even less fair. And on market governance, I think I gave you the example of the non-competes, but we could go through each of those different types of regulation, and I could tell you how specific regulations would affect the balance of power, which would affect the balance of income. I'll just give you one more example, which I think would be kind of intuitive. We talked about labor, so let's talk about finance. The financial service sector's share of our economy has roughly doubled over the last couple of decades. I don't know the exact numbers, but from roughly, let's say, 3% of the economy to 6% of the economy. Now, I'm guessing most of you don't feel like, oh, well, the financial sector has doubled its utility to all of us. Like, we're just so much better off thanks to a bigger financial sector. More likely hypothesis would be that the financial sector found ways to make more money, to extract more rent from us, right? In other words, that they, charge us extra fees and all of that, and without providing us greater value. So my point is that's due to financial regulations, financial reforms over the past 40 years, dating back at least to the 1980s, that have made it easier for those financial institutions to extract rents, right? To basically extract value from us rather than provide more value to us. And so a predistribution policy would say, hey, let's try to move that one in the other direction. So those are a couple of specific examples. I'm happy to talk about other countries, but just one moment on the United States. To its credit, the Biden administration tried some of these things. Now, we might say, well, if they did, then why didn't we feel it, and why didn't they win the election? Lots of reasons for that. The media has certainly, and disinformation has a factor. But I think also the fact that, pre-distribution policies don't have an immediate effect. So even if like people might say, oh, we want you, that's great, get rid of junk fees. Oh, that's great, get rid of non-compete clauses. It's not like you're going to feel that immediately the way you feel inflation, right? You go to the store, something costs 50% more. You feel that immediately. So my point is that the Biden administration, while certainly not perfect, made some effort I would say definitely moved in the right direction on many of these topics. Now moving cross-nationally, I don't think there's a perfect country, but I would definitely say Japan, the Scandinavian countries are better on, it depends on the issues. On the market governance ones, I might say Japan is better. On public investment, I might say the Scandinavian countries are better. So there's lots of models to look at. I mean, if we take healthcare, for example, everywhere is better than the United States in terms of universal coverage. So there's lots of models that would give us ideas about how to move in a positive direction.
Thank you. I have a question myself. Is employee-owned companies or ESOPs similar to your idea in a pre-distribution corporation?
So yes, that would be one possible pre-distribution solution in terms of whatever labor markets. It might not be my favorite. The reason I would have some concerns, it depends on the details, but they can make employees very vulnerable to the financial fortunes of their own firm, right? If they have a lot of shares in that one firm, so that their whatever retirement portfolio might not be as diversified as it should be ideally. So even though that's a mechanism for power, right? Because as shareholders, you could show up en masse at the shareholder meeting and say, hey, we're employees, but we're also shareholders, and we want you to do X, Y, Z. So I do think that it would be positive in that sense. But I guess what I'm getting at is that I think an even better solution would be employee representation on the boards of corporations. And thinking cross-nationally, that's what they have in Germany, for example. They have a system of co-determination, which means that in a large company, the supervisory board by law is required to have 50% representatives from the labor side. And so it's co-determination because it's sort of like management and labor are both represented on the supervisory board. And so they both have a say. And so if you're coming up with some sort of restructuring plan for that corporation, they kind of are forced to compromise with each other. And labor's voice is kind of integrated by law. So that would be even more powerful than employee ownership, and it wouldn't have the downside of having employees be too vulnerable to their fortune, the stock share of their own company.
Eye-opening regarding Germany. You noted that Marketcraft has had some spectacular successes and also failures. What do you think are the most important prerequisites in crafting successful market norms, laws, regulation, and practices?
So in the book Marketcraft, I say there's huge stakes in getting Marketcraft right. And as you suggest, I say it can go really well or it can go really badly. And as my two examples, I say I do a thought experiment. I say, well, what do we think would be the greatest economic success story and the greatest economic failure in the United States of the last 50 years? Now, reasonable people will disagree, perhaps, but I would say the greatest economic success story would be the digital revolution. And the greatest economic failure would be the global financial crisis of 2008. Like I said, people might disagree, but my point is they are both the products of Marketcraft, right? So one was like really good Marketcraft, the other was really bad Marketcraft. And the real impact, right, on our daily lives is huge. I like to tell my students, I said, you're probably too young to remember the global financial crisis, but in case you're wondering why you can't get into the classes you want to take, that's because of the global financial crisis. So like these things have very, because that's when we started like austerity at Cal, and we started restricting the amount of courses in classrooms and whatever. I won't go into that in great detail, but I think you get my point. So then to get to the heart of your question, like what makes for that? When I thought about like what's the difference between those two cases in the United States, I said, well, actually, if we think as political scientists, a couple of the concepts we often use are state capacity and state autonomy. Maybe it's useless jargon, but state capacity just means do you have a well-trained bureaucracy that knows what it's doing? And state autonomy means, are you captured by political interests, or are you serving the public interest? And so my point is, if I were going to ask that about those two cases, I would come up with different answers, right? In other words, in the digital economy case, I would say, yes, we had state capacity. And yes, the government was relatively autonomous it wasn't, captured by a particular industry. And in the financial case, I would say it was the opposite, that we had low state capacity and we were captured by the financial industry, right? And that led us into the financial crisis, right? Again, reasonable people might disagree, but if I were trying to simplify the very complicated story of what got us into the global financial crisis, I would say one major factor was listening too much to the banks, right? Set up rules that made it easier for them to make money, and ultimately that didn't go well for Main Street, for the rest of us regular people. The digital revolution is also a complex story because it's not actually, I wouldn't argue that there was one grand plan that succeeded, because I don't think that's true, but there were a whole series of different policies that together really helped to fuel that revolution. So just to give a couple of examples, one was, just government investment in technology. The government really supported R&D. Part of this was for military reasons, but it ended up having a good impact, and created the technology that became the internet. But then there's other policies where the connection doesn't seem obvious, but it was important. For example, the reform of telecommunications, including breaking up AT&T. That was critical to the digital revolution because it brought down telecommunications costs. And if you imagine all those apps that we now love, we wouldn't have those if we were still paying for communication by the minute, right? So because of that regulatory reform, that created the basis for this internet revolution. And another is antitrust policy. This also is kind of a complicated story, but basically IBM and AT&T, the biggest electronics companies of the day, were not allowed to sell their own. They could make semiconductors for their computers or their systems, but they couldn't sell them. And that kind of decentralized power in the economy. And it wasn't obvious at the time, but now with hindsight, we can say, well, actually, that was really important that IBM and AT&T were not able to control all of the electronics system, because that's what allowed kind of the bottom-up innovation that generated the internet revolution. So I realize that was a long-winded answer to your question, but the essence is that politics matters, that state capacity matters, that not being too beholden to particular industries. Those are all things that eventually funnel into better policies and better life for us.
Thank you, sir. Maybe one last question for you. I know we're taking a lot of your time. Given the existing political polarization in our society, how can the Dems communicate pre-distributive policies proposals in a way that the working class will trust?
So some people are suspicious of these proposals I'm making because they argue that, for example, by cracking down on big tech, or actually we could take the crypto example, cracking down on crypto, the Biden administration kind of lost friends, particularly, let's say, in Silicon Valley, for example. So you could argue, I'm just arguing against myself for a minute, and then I'm going to defend myself. You could argue that, well, this was kind of sort of tried under Biden and it failed both economically and politically, so bad idea. So my rebuttal to that and my answer to your question would be, okay, but now is the moment to make the case against oligarchy, right? It was harder to make when the Democrats were in power. Now they're not in power. You see the oligarchy in action, and you see just how bad it is for the economy, and what a wrecking ball it is. Now, we still have the media environment, so I'm not naive enough to think that that message gets through to everyone. But I think some people are going to get it, as the Trump administration hits their 401k and it hits their prices at the supermarket. People are going to get that, and they're also going to say, wait, it's the richest man in the world that's doing all of this. So I guess my point is that, while Republicans make gains as backlash against Democratic policies, when the Democrats are out of power, it goes the other way around, right? And Republican missteps become opportunities for the Democrats. And in this case, I think there's a very tight link between what's going wrong with this administration and precisely the problems that I'm addressing here. Maybe, again, I'm not, I'm not saying that expressing it the way I just did in this presentation is necessarily the best way to appeal to the mass of American voters, but I think it could be translated pretty easily, right? You say, well, look, do you want Elon Musk running your economy? Do you want him running your political system? Do you think that the people with the most money should have the most power? Or do you think we, the people, should have power? So I do think that that's an opportunity. I think that, in other words, we have to ride the backlash against the excessive concentration of market power and political power in a few individuals and a few corporations, and that will resonate with working people in America.
Excellent point, sir. Excellent. Karen, how are we on time, if you want to?
Well, we've taken up almost an hour of the professor's time, and I thank you so much for your excellent talk. Really, I've learned a lot. Thank you, and thank you, Sherry.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Great questions, and I wish you all the best on your battles.
We wish ourselves the best too, and thank you for being in the fight and adding this wonderful information to our toolbox. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Now I would like to share my screen, and I will do so at this point, I hope. How does that look? Good. Okay. As I mentioned, again, thank you, Professor Vogel. That was wonderful. That was great. I really thought it excellent talk. We'd like to go over at least a recap of the May 3rd rally and thank people who helped with that rally. First of all, thank you to all of the participants who came to the rally. We had 500 plus. I believe that Marla had a clicker and went around and found, and she felt that there were 600 people who attended our May Day rally. The photos that you see on this slide and the next slide are courtesy of the pro bono photo.org site, and Guy Cummins, who's been taking pictures of our rallies, has really done a lovely job. And if you go to our website, you'll see the rally or the photos from the May 3rd rally, and they were courtesy of Mr. Cummins. As our May Day rally, which occurred on May 3rd rally, or May 3rd, it really takes a village of people to do this. And many people who will not be named, but did a wonderful job. But I'm going to name some of the major players in the rally. First of all, our MC, Faith Alpfer. She was just wonderful. She kept things moving along, gave it energy and excitement and meaning and inspiration. So we're so fortunate to have someone like Faith to be on our team and helping us create rallies that are meaningful for people. We had two speakers. The first speaker was Caleb Matheny, and he was from the Northern California Plasters Apprenticeship, and he's the training director. And when I initially, Jan Potts gave us the lead for Caleb. And when I initially contacted Caleb, I didn't realize that he actually lives in Sacramento, and he traveled from Sacramento to Livermore to speak to our rally. So I was quite honored. Another speaker that wasn't planned, but Faith brought him up, was our own council member, Evan Branning. And Evan spoke as the president of the Associations of Pleasanton Teachers. And both of our speakers really incorporated the idea of labor unions and the support of labor unions and the importance of labor unions and the importance of labor into our May Day rally. So thank you both, Evan and Caleb. They were wonderful. John Hughes provided our sound and music, wonderful combination, and he worked with Faith to create a lovely seamless rally program. And he also provided his group called the Resist Tones, who sang some really lovely protest songs. So thank you, John Hughes and the Resist Tones. Livermore Advocates for Public Education had the staffed the sign table and created the sign table, and also took photography of the rally as well. Jim McGinnis supplies us with great signs. I think that we have some of the best signs of any organization in the Bay Area. If you look at the quality of the signs that Jim has been donating to our rallies, it's quite impressive. And I think, Jim deserves a big thank you for all of the supplies and effort that he's put into creating signs for our organization. And last but not least, Jim Costa for putting together a great safety team to keep us all safe and secure during our rallies, and to have as much of a nonviolent rally as possible. I wanted to mention something about a link tree that Kyoko put together about building and maintaining a nonviolent movement. I found this website on I found a website that actually had the number of days left in this administration. And according to this website, we have 1,344 days left in the MAGA administration. And that means that we have a lot of rallies in our future, unfortunately. And we want all our rallies to be nonviolent and safe for our attendees. Another reason that we want our rallies to be nonviolent is also, I think, that the MAGA groups really want to own the libs. They want to have some reaction from us. And if we don't give a reaction in some of the rallies and in some of the protests, they go away. So I think it's important that we learn how to interact with bullies and the MAGA people, and to do so in a nonviolent and safe way. So Kyoko has created this Linktree site, and it contains a sign up for the Dublin Tesla rallies, and also links to de-escalation and calming videos of how to de-escalate tense situations, and also how to calm people when they are agitated. It also includes the Gandhi team training videos, which are excellent as well. So look at that link for more information on how to sign up for the Tesla rallies, as well as de-escalation and calming videos and the Gandhi team training videos. Upcoming events. We have a lot going on, especially in the month of June. June seems to be really active. And on June 14th, Livermore Indivisible will be walking in the rodeo parade. Across the entire nation on June 14th, there is going to be a No Kings rally. However, because that coincides with the Livermore Rodeo Parade, we do not want to antagonize the local people and gum up the parade. So we're going to be supporting the parade and not having a rally. So our support and our walk in the parade is going to be in lieu of having a rally in Livermore on that day. So we really want to show our strength in numbers, so please join us. And I want to stress that this is not a political event. We are going to be highlighting the positives, our patriotism, our love of this country, our love of the Constitution, and the fact that we are proud to be residents of this great country or citizens of this great country. We ask that you wear the Livermore Indivisible t-shirts or something red, white, and blue. So if you don't have a Livermore Indivisible t-shirt, I think Keith has about 5 t-shirts left. So if you would like information on how to get a t-shirt, please send us email and we can direct you how to get a Livermore Indivisible t-shirt. If you don't have one and you don't want one, wear something red, white, and blue. And please, please, no political signs or any kind of wearables. So we really want you to sign up for the rodeo. One reason is that until we get very close to the rodeo parade date, we really won't know where we're going to be meeting and congregating prior to the parade. So that if you sign up, it'll allow us to send you email about where to meet and additional details that we don't really have right now. So please sign up for the rodeo. On June 21st, Livermore Indivisible, along with the Livermore Advocates for Public Education, are going to be co-sponsoring a table at the Juneteenth Festival, and we need volunteers to staff that table. Approximately 2 volunteers per 2-hour shift. If we get more, that's the more the merrier. So please consider volunteering for the Juneteenth Festival. Now, finally, we get to our next meeting, which is on June 22nd, and that's the Livermore Indivisible General Meeting. And it's going to feature Professor Amy Bello. Professor Bello is going to be discussing the techniques that authoritarians have used to gain power in other countries. Now, why would you ask about that? Well, we've seen some techniques that have been going on in our own country. For example, the attacks on higher education, lawyers, etc. We've seen that happening now, and she's going to tell us what the playbook has been in other countries and how authoritarians have taken over other countries and compare it to what is currently occurring in our own country. And she is an associate professor at Cal State East Bay in international relations and comparative politics. It will be an in-person meeting, so please sign up for that. And last but not least, in July, we have a picnic planned. Not too much information at this time. There's no save the date, but stay tuned. We're working on it. Location and time is TBD. We'll have games for kids and all the kids at heart, and certainly families will be welcome. And I just want to thank you for coming. Thank you, Sherry, for getting that wonderful speaker, Professor Vogel. He really did an excellent job. Thank you all for coming. If anybody has any questions, please unmute yourself and ask any questions. In the meantime, don't forget to go to our website. If you're interested in donating to Livermore Indivisible, please do so. We have a donate button on our website, and it is through Act Blue, and that is being targeted by this administration, but it is our mechanism for receiving donations. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I will stop sharing my screen. Mary Turner. Go ahead.
Hi there. Great presentation. Thank you. What is it? The 21st event?
Yes.
At the banquet
Mhm.
is in conflict with the Livermore citywide garage sale. Is there could there be some kind of flyer or poster to distribute to the garage sales, redirecting them to this event, to the banquet? I am having one of these sales and would love to, if somebody comes to the sale, redirect them.
We'll take that's a suggestion. We'll take that suggestion and see whether we want to publicize in that way. I think that would be a good thing. The only thing that I would add is that we would like people to register ahead of time, just so that we know the numbers, and because we do have limited availability.
Sure. Well, this is a major citywide event, and there are usually at least 100 sales. And so if there's a way to redirect people or ask them to go elsewhere after they've done their yard sale stuff, it would be useful.
Good idea, Mary. Well, thank you for that suggestion. Marilyn?
Yeah, many years ago, I don't remember exactly when, 2016, 2017, when Indivisible first started, I put up on some for a donation, a monthly donation, but I don't know if that still exists
It
then.
does. It does.
So then it's already there.
Well, you should check. Is it being
I'm not sure how to check, but I guess go on what did you call it?
Act Blue?
Act Blue, and maybe I have an account with them and I can check it that way.
Yeah. The other thing is to look at your credit card. I'm assuming you used a credit card. That would be probably the more accurate way.
Yeah. I'll ask my husband.
Joanne?
Yeah, June 21st is the Juneteenth event. And we are not organizing that event. We're just having a table there. So we would have to refer that request, I think, to the people who are organizing the event.
Any other comments or questions? If not, I will certainly stop the recording.
And just a reminder